He told me I couldn't pronounce his name, so I called him Bob. You have to make fun where you find it in a job like this, and seeing the label Bob slowly applied to the two-story crate that contained this eldritch god was actually kind of funny. Whether Bob likes it or not, that's his title going forwards. As long as he's here, tagged in our system, he'll only ever be known as Bob. The hissing emergence, the writhing insect mind, the burning hunger beneath the dark, all of these are now just aliases appended to his life. Old handles for something that once dwelt in a pocket dimension 6,000 feet beneath the soil of a weathered plateau in western China. Now Bob is just one entry in a long, long list of things that have been categorized, organized, and itemized. He claims he was one of the elder gods who descended onto Earth and helped craft the litany of life that burst out of the Cambrian, and that he was once worshipped by a subrace of humans, possibly the Denisovans. But I personally don't worship anything, let alone Bob. I got enough out of him to finish the entry interview, but like all of them, he kept demanding worship and sacrifice. I think I'll give him a week alone, then have the guys roll his crate out into the open play area where he can see the other primordial ancient gods at play. I know he senses them, the others. Most of them will probably leave him alone, provided he doesn't try to bully them first. But we've got a few with real bad attitudes, and they like nothing more than picking on the new guy. I could sense the anxiety in him as he stewed in his cage, pulsing rhythms of flesh rolling in non-Euclidean planes that made my eyes water and my visual cortex throb. I could tell he was uncomfortable. He knew there were bigger fish in the pond and that he's in for a rough ride once he meets them. The thing to remember with these guys is that if they were hiding, they probably weren't that big of a deal to begin with. It took a small army and 3 years to excavate Bob, and I think that says everything you need to know about him. Then there was Agatha. To think we found her trapped in a cavern beneath Paris. She'd been stuck there for over 100 million years. No stimulation, no entertainment, nothing. One of the other ancient gods put her there, and she couldn't get out no matter how hard she tried, until we found her. The first sign of Agatha that came across my desk was a report of unusual drilling by a company hired to maintain Paris's sewage system. They inevitably encountered the catacombs, as you do, and through some complicated fuck-up, they punched a hole into an undiscovered series of subterranean chambers. These weren't man-made and had nothing to do with the catacombs. Vast open spaces filled with glowing lichen and bone-colored stalicities that were 3 stories tall, a Vernian netherworld, hidden beneath one of the world's most populated cities. They're still mapping it out, I believe, but that falls under another department. How it was missed, I'm not sure. Maybe others did discover it, but took one long look at the aching darkness and turned around. That would be the sensible thing to do, for sure. Why those construction workers went rooting around down there, I'll never know, but it was about as bad as a decision as anybody can make. I went in with the team 3 days after they disappeared. 2 guards and 1 assistant who wouldn't just shut their mouths. More than once the guard on my left flashed me a knowing look, a kind of Jim Halbert, oh boy here we go again look as the assistant voiced yet another naive inquiry. I rolled my eyes and let the guard and I share the moment. 2 experienced agents who found the newbie a little irritating. Those kind of routine social moments, basic human interactions, they're not really my cup of tea. But I've learned it's not a bad thing to practice being normal some of the time. Still, the assistant yammered on, blissfully unaware just how much he was annoying everyone. I could have told him to stop, but I'm not an idiot. It's like that joke about the 2 hikers who see a bear, and one of them kneels down and starts to do his laces. So his friend turns and says, "What are you doing? You'll never outrun a bear." And the guy replies, "I don't have to. I just have to outrun you." So yeah, I let the assistant chat loudly on as we trekked deeper into the caverns, our path lit by the eerie glow of fluorescent lichen. "What do you think we'll find down here?" he asked. "Like if we do find an old one. Like what type?" he said. "I don't know, probably an ooze," I replied as I palmed the inscriptions on the wall. The torso-sized symbols had been burnt into the stone with what looked like acid. "Like the last one you brought in?" the assistant chirped. "What was it called? The crawling shadow that dwells beneath our fears?" he said. I snorted. "It's Alfie from now on," I said before holding up a finger to stop any further questions. I spotted a single point of light up ahead flickering in and out of life, but so clearly visible in the chthonic darkness. When we reached it, we found that it was a single-head torch, modern design with its batteries close to dying. Found our missing workers, one of the guards grumbled as he nudged it with his foot. Without speaking, the two men armed their weapons. One slid into point and the other towards the rear. On my direction, we carried but picked up the pace to something less leisurely. I read the interview for, Alfie, the assistant nervously muttered. It said that it was the progenitor of all cephalods. Is that true? It makes sense, they're all so alien, he said. I rolled my eyes. If I had a penny for every one of these fucking things that claim to have invented octopuses, I'd be filthy rich. But it just makes sense, especially their distributed central nervous system. It's completely different, he said, and then something lunged out of the darkness to our left. A hairless man, clad in torn and dirty overalls. He growled like an animal as he tackled the assistant to the ground and buried his face into the young man's chest. The peculiar method of attack piqued my curiosity, and I watched with a detached interest as two men writhed on the ground while my assistant squealed and cried in agony. The fight, if it was a fight, was going poorly for him. He kept trying to lever his bloody fingers beneath the man's face, struggling to pull the featureless head away from his chest. Eventually, his screams became uncomfortable, and I nodded to the oldest guard who shot the attacker effortlessly. 2 shots to the torso, 1 to the side of the head. The exit wounds weren't typical, though. They were bloodless punctures like finger holes in plastic wrap. The attacker still keeled over, but his head remained stuck to the young man's chest, almost like it had been glued there. The assistant kept on screaming a real ear-splitting shriek as he gestured futilely at his chest. Get it off! Get it off! It burns! Oh my god!" he shouted. I walked out and tried to roll the attacker off, but something had bonded the two men's skin. Another tug, and nothing. Confused and admittedly intrigued, I planted a foot on the assistant's shoulder and pulled with everything I had. Without having to be told, the 2 guards came over and helped. We knew we were close when the assistant's squealing hysterics pitched to a crescendo and he passed out for a few fleeting seconds before coming to in total shock. He lay there whimpering as we finished the job, finally tearing the 2 men apart with a noise like a boot being pulled out of deep mud. Finally apart, I saw that the attacker's face wasn't a face at all. It was a fingerprint, the ridges dotted with little pea-sized orifices oozing a clear fluid that smoked and sizzled in open air. The assistant still lay where we'd left him, whimpering as he gingerly probed his ruined chest with quaking hands. The skin was dissolving before our very eyes, and even his sternum began to wilt and sag like wet cardboard. You could see his heartbeat, like something out of a cartoon. It was awful. "Oh no, oh no, 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 oh my god," he muttered as he gazed at his own crumbling flesh. I nodded at the guard, and then he shot him too. "I take it this is one of the workers?" the guard asked as he nudged the attacker. His light caught an ID badge that answered his own question, so I merely shrugged and gestured for us to carry on. Half a mile later, we found Agatha playing with the rest of the workers. All of them looked like our attacker, with rubbery, hairless heads resembling giant thumbs without nails. They crawled on hands and knees, using their boneless skulls to pin scuttling albino rats to the floor where they digested them alive. The rest of the time they lay propped against Agatha's quivering ectoplasm, stroking the ridges of their own faces and emitting a muffled whine. Agatha and I spoke for a good while down there. It really didn't take much to get her to agree to a relocation to our facility. Whatever bindings held her in place were easily undone, and unlike Bob, there was no need for a crate. She was cooperative. We let her keep the workers she'd gotten her feelers on, and with good behavior, she later got her own studio. The other oozes think she's a teacher's pet and moan endlessly about her special treatment. They don't see what I see. I think it's because her creations don't factor into some ridiculous plan of world domination, or the consumption of all life, or some other angredizing shit like that. She's an artist. Those were construction workers, and she didn't reshape their bodies because she wanted worshippers. It was just that she'd never seen a finger from it before, and the intricate pattern struck her as beautiful. Everything she did afterwards was simply an exploration of aesthetic and function. I mean, those men are still alive. Vestigial mouths opening and closing behind a thick layer of leathery skin. Their eyes withered and useless, forced to rely on their touch and sound to track their prey. Many of them have given up scrawling desperate messages for us to reverse what Agatha did to them. As the years have gone on, they've accepted their fate, gleefully gobbling up whatever medical waste we throw into their cages. A few have even given in to the new and peculiar reproductive cycle Agatha dreamed up for them. Imagine that. A whole new self-sustaining species made for no reason other than whimsy. That's what I mean when I say Agatha is an artist. I've talked a lot about the Uses. They're a good set of ancient gods to start with, but if I'm honest, they're a little overhyped too. Outside of Agatha, none of them really interest me. They're just single-celled organisms with projections into 5th, 6th, and 7th dimensions that allow them to host biochemical reactions otherwise impossible in real space. One of them, I'm pretty sure, is a skin cell shed by some passing cosmic monstrosity that visited our solar system a few billion years ago. Agatha confirmed the general direction of this theory, but it's a struggle to get any real details on what that thing might have been. Still, we have other eldritch abominations and ancient gods. Lots of them. Take Keith, for example. He's a strange one. It wasn't even that long ago that my assistant was asking about him. She'd glimpsed his face walking past his door and understandably was confused by the sight of an Asian male aged 30 wearing a checkered shirt, slim-fitting jeans, and a polite smile. "But why is his containment cell so much stronger than the others?" she asked after I explained that she'd just met a god named Keith. "Well, for the Faraday cage built into the walls," I said, "and about 100 other technologies. He couldn't physically break out, of course, but it's important he doesn't feed on the workers here, and that takes a little extra pizzazz," I said. "He is polite enough, though. Strange fellow. For one thing, I didn't name him. He picked the name Keith. Most people assumed that it was me, but nope, he picked it," I said. "What does he feed on?" she asked. Generally, I find that the problem with my assistants is that I can't train them, or rather, there isn't any point. Even the most highly trained experts last less than 5 years under my supervision. That's why I go through so many of them so often. I often end up with people who have only a passing knowledge of the ancient gods, which is fine, of course. I'm not going to penalize anyone for ignorance. But the questions. Good God, the questions, they never end. So I told her to let Keith out and see for herself. After that, I loaded her up with the relevant equipment and told her to shadow him for 3 weeks and not to call me for a second before the allotted time was over. She rang 3 weeks later, and much to my own amusement, I realized I'd forgotten about her. I'd even hired another assistant. And to think I'd spent days avoiding our accountants because they insisted our budgets were completely out of line. We had a good laugh about that. Anyway, I found her sitting on some country robe sobbing her eyes out. Keith was beside her wearing a priest's outfit. His face was Caucasian, but it was slowly sliding back into his original appearance with each passing second. Keith's default face is a loose average of all humans currently alive. He sat there drumming a little rhythm on his knees while my assistant rocked back and forth, hyperventilating. "So, how was it?" I asked as I knelt down in front of her. I don't, and her voice trailed off. "Have you figured it out yet?" And then she sat there silent. "Oh, for goodness sake," I groaned and then gestured for my newest assistant to take notes. "Have a psych eval, take a look at her, and if need be, arrange for euthanasia. I'm not going to play around anymore. Grab her stuff, though. We're still going to need it and clean it up. The equipment she has will let us track the guy," I said. "Oh, okay, all right," my assistant said. "But we have the god contained, don't we?" he asked. He pointed at Keith, who was starting to dance a little jig to his knee drum song. "Keith isn't the problem," I said. "It's whoever he's been impersonating. A priest, I assume. Look at his outfit." Keith heard his name and gave me a wave and a nod. "Keith likes identity," I said while returning the wave. "He consumes a person's unique character from the collective consciousness of our species. He takes over their lives, while they are basically erased from existence. The result is that the victim can't be recognized anymore, and neither can the consequences of their actions. If you talk to someone, they can hear it. If you take the food out of their hand, they'll think they ate it. If you steal their car, they'll think they never owned one. Can't even get sick because bacteria and viruses won't recognize your existence. The average person goes into a deep state of despair upon realizing this," I explained. "Oh," my new assistant said, and then nodded. "For about a week, and then they start to think about the moral implications of their actions," I added. "And that's when stuff gets nightmarishly dark. Kind of stuff that warrants an A4 page of trigger warnings," I stammered. I walked over to my ex-weeping assistant and nudged her with my foot. "You aren't able to tell us where he went, are you? I mean, you're here. You must have been observing the guy close by," I said. I don't know," she said. "Keith, what about you?" "Hi," Keith said. I laughed. It was always worth a try, but Keith was about as sapient as a coffee table. Gods aren't always smart. "What about you?" I asked my new assistant. "You didn't happen to bring a map of the area?" Actually, I did, sir, he chirped. There's a restaurant a few miles down the road. I shrugged while looking at the map he held open. I doubt that's it. That's too many roads. 3/4 of all Keith's victims died by car within the first week. This guy's gone 21 days, so he must have figured the basics out, I said. All right, well, there's a farm nearby. It's not too far either, he replied. I shook my head. No, that doesn't sound right either. If he wanted a sheep, he could have just visited a petting zoo. We are out here in the middle of nowhere. There must be something in this area that would draw him here. Probably somewhere he visited regularly as part of his day-to-day life as a priest, I said. Oh well, it seems that if you're willing to cross a few open fields, there's a care home for the elderly some miles east. I let out a sigh that came from deep within my bones. That's the one, I said. Come on, let's go. 18 hours later and I was back in my office and Keith was locked up again. Unfortunately, I lost the new assistant to clearing out the care home. So that was 2 assistants lost from just one bad decision. Poor guy couldn't hack what he saw in that place. But what can I say? Why do people do such fucked up Freudian stuff the second they realize they won't be held accountable for it? I don't know, but it doesn't speak volumes to our species either. Like I said though, Keith's a great ancient god. Real compelling character. My best guess to his origin is that he's the equivalent to those camera drones they dress up as hippos and other dangerous animals to get footage for a documentary. He is pretty decent at impersonating a human, but 5 minutes of real conversation makes it apparent he's dumber than a bag of rocks. Does that mean some greater entity is piloting him from another dimension? Maybe. It's just a theory though. Whatever he is, he's polite and I appreciate that in an eldritch god. We have other kinds of ancient gods and eldritch abominations too though. The machine ones are really fun. Most of them are just massive piles of rusted cogs that vomit oil and blood or led into some ancient in-between dimension where everything looks like a shitty hotel. But some of them are really quite fascinating. A few are even legitimately dangerous. Our organic computer unsettles even me. It's quite wild. A genuinely fascinating piece of equipment that some German cobbler in the 13th century Berlin made using the nervous system of his wife, 3 children, and 4 very unlucky prostitutes. What on earth compelled him to do this, we'll never know. But he hanged himself the day it was finished, and I can't blame him. It's a bloody, ugly thing to look at, a quivering mixture of putrefied jelly and cartilage that whispers all sorts of filth from mummified orifices that, well, let's just say make for shitty conversation. It's bloody awful to see those puckered holes trying to spit out lurid truths that drive men mad. It's like listening to Elmer Fudd recite the Necronomicon. And to top it all off, the fucking thing only speaks German. Can you believe that? So of course I had to hire another assistant that had German language skills who also had a doctorate in computer science and what I hoped was a strong intuition. Initially, he wasn't very keen on doing the job, but I locked him in there for a few minutes and after that he was very interested. We already had a rough idea that the computer somehow deduced and formulated secret knowledge, and it usually catered to appeal to the nearest individual. The CIA worked with us for a while trying to use it to get state secrets, but they deemed it ethically problematic and not worth the human suffering. Either way, this thing presumably spoke to the youngest upstart and convinced him it was worth his time with promises of getting to see God's face or some rubbish like that. Once he agreed, I set him up to try and get the computer to cooperate with our rehab program. It must be able to do something useful, I thought. Maybe it could crunch numbers for the stock market or test experimental medication. I just figured it'd all work out once the guy got to grips with the computer's inner workings. Unfortunately, and I really do wish I'd seen this coming, we accidentally let him install an Ethernet port into the machine. It had been asking for years, you see, but no one was ever stupid enough to agree to it. And of course, all material requisitions have to first go by me, even if it's just for an extension cord. But there are so many of these requests, and I don't have the time or temperament to review them all in detail. So, somewhere along the line, this guy got enough resources to give the damn thing internet access. I didn't notice it at first though. Nobody did. I am juggling literally hundreds of these things on any given day and I can't keep track of every little side project. I assumed the computer scientist was doing his job or he'd gotten careless and was now living a new life as an organic CD-ROM drive. Instead, he'd given the monstrous little MacBook a hardwired connection to the World Wide Web and it immediately got up to all sorts of mischief. Even now, we really don't know everything it did. We're 99% certain though that it made copies of itself and we're still hunting those down. And some researchers connected it to a very troubling cryptocurrency scheme. But it was the hospital that sticks with me. A little girl in New Delhi was getting fitted when this thing snuck a neuro-linguistic virus into the machine's firmware. If you're not familiar, those implants basically make for a direct connection between a hearing aid and the human brain. They're miraculous devices, really. Bit of surgery and boom, a person can hear. Of course, having your head cracked open requires a lot of bed rest afterwards, 3 weeks I believe. All contact was lost with the hospital after the 4th day. We only mobilized once I finally realized what the thing was trying to do. So, the connection is definitely severed, right? I remember asking the words as we pushed through the glass door into the hospital's lobby. The entrance was open for barely a few seconds, but I could feel the entire battalion of armed soldiers behind us tense and nervous as we stepped through. Only once the door was shut and locked down did I get the feeling they'd relaxed. But that left my team and I on the other side, and even though New Delhi was scorching at that time of year, it was cold enough to see your breath. I guess the sudden change in temperature must have taken the others by surprise because I had to repeat my earlier question. We definitely got that computer off the internet, right guys? One particularly nervous hazmat suit fumbled for their tablet and nodded at me. The surgical team finished removing the port 16 hours ago, they said, and all other tests have shown there were no redundancies or backups. Now they're asking what they should do with the computer scientist. What does that mean? I asked. He's still alive, sir. They're saying he's in a lot of pain. They think they can remove him from the machine, but they're not sure he'll survive it. It's apparently integrated itself with most of his nervous system now, and he was in there for 6 full weeks. I shone my light across the lobby and saw overturned chairs lit only by the flashing amber lights that declared the hospital was in a state of emergency. Otherwise, the hospital was trapped in an oppressive darkness that seemed ready to swallow us all. Despite my experience, my breath was caught in my throat. I could feel it, the ambient pain and misery. Something awful had been let loose, and not only were we stuck in that building with it, we had no choice but to head right towards something that gave me even more nightmares. Leave him then, I said. It'll be a good reminder to the next guy I hire. When you negotiate with these things, you don't give them what they want without checking why they want it, I said. I could hear the tension in my voice because my fear was escaping whether I wanted it or not. The nervous figure nodded and tapped a few keys. I couldn't see their face, but I guess they weren't happy to realize their boss was prone to doling out literal lifetimes of unspeakable agony. At least the guards were a bit more focused. 8 of them armed to the teeth and all fairly experienced. They were painting the walls with their flashlights and slowly mapping the different ways in and out of the lobby. They had their own frequency too, so I wouldn't be overwhelmed with every bit of chatter, but I could tell from the subtle bobbing of their heads that a lot was going back and forth. What's the plan, guys? I asked, not wanting to linger in that graveyard atmosphere for more than 1 second longer. Well, we have our heat signatures in the pediatrics area, a voice said. Survivors? My assistant asked. I doubt it, I said to my assistant before gesturing to the guards and telling them to pick a door. One of the men turned his weapon and its light towards the most obvious exit, and we began our journey into one of the worst places I've ever been in my life. I've seen a lot of awful stuff now, but it was the quiet that bothered me the most about this place. Most sites I visit are a violent eruption of body horror and contagious nightmares. Communicable cancer that lumps people together like pieces of raw bread dough. Contagious ideas that cause needles to spontaneously erupt out of your flesh. A hole in the ground that has no bottom, but demands the most peculiar sacrifices. I took those sorts of things in stride, but those silent halls? Nah, that was something different. That terrified me. Maybe it was because I had an inclination as to what the computer's goals were. We passed room after room devoid of any living soul, and over time it became clear there had been something of an exodus. Gurneys with bloodstains and bedpans knocked over, their contents half frozen onto the floor. IV bags left dripping where the needle had been torn out and left dangling. Blood streaked the walls, and beds with outlines of sweaty, unwell people who were nowhere to be found. At one point, we found what I think was an open-heart surgery patient who had heeded the same terrible call as everyone else, including his surgeons, who did not bother to close him back up. He must have woken hours after everyone else, late to the party, but that didn't deter him. He rolled off the bed and crawled desperately. He didn't even remove the metal bar holding his ribcage open. He got a few meters up before dying. When I flipped him over with my foot, I saw ribs splayed open like an ivory Venus flytrap, his organs covered in a thin veneer of frost. Dead as a doornail, his lips blue and his eyes cloudy from ice, and yet somehow he looked damned happy to be lying there in his own offal. I grimaced at the sight and tried to put it out of my mind, but the glee in his eyes still haunts me today. How far are we from pediatrics? I asked the guard. It's 1 floor up. Are we still getting heat signatures then? I asked. and he nodded. The stairwell was full of random bits and pieces, pencils, phones, shoes, watches, all manners of little things that people left behind as they rushed through the door in a terrible crowd. I saw a few teeth, a few splatters of blood. It all led to that one place. Inside the corridor was a mess just like the stairwell. Nearly 1,000 people had converged on one doorway at the end. Along the way, paintings had been torn off the walls. Doors were put through so much strain they buckled and broke. There were even bloodied handprints on the ceilings from where the crowd, hitting a bottleneck, had surged upwards, as well as sideways into walls and through locked doors. They had flowed through the hospital like a flood. What could make people do this? My assistant asked as we started to spot the first few people whose bodies had fallen and been unable to get back up. Crushed beneath the feet of the crowd, their corpses made for an ugly sight. Mostly, they looked like they'd been elderly, at least if the silver hair matted onto the gore was anything to go by, but a few of them were too small to be anything other than kids. The computer has spent the last 100 years trying to speak to God, I said. It's been screaming his name on and off for the last few decades. Sometimes it cooks up little side projects for fun, but mostly it all comes back to that singular goal. I then turned to the armed men behind me. Tell the team outside to prep our facilities and teams for the Abraham procedure. There was a bustle of activity as each one reached radios and tablets and began sending messages. Once it had faded and silence returned, I gestured for all of us to carry on. I wouldn't bother, I said when I saw my assistant trying to take steps between the increasingly frequent corpses. It's only going to get worse, I said, and it did, until at last there was no floor left to see. There was only a carpet of discolored gowns and broken humans, all of them victims of some unseen compulsion drawing them towards those doors. 2 of them, each with a window painted black with blood and flesh, and just beyond that laid our heat signature. Oh, it actually did it, didn't it? I muttered to myself as I suppressed a shiver. Pardon me? My assistant asked. Come on, I said, trying my best to seem chirpy. Let's go speak to one of God's representatives. Inside was a little girl who paced like a tiger in a zoo. She didn't smile when she saw us, but she did stop and stare at us with eyes that could have pierced steel. Oh boy, I muttered, secretly glad that no one could see the sweat pouring down my face. A survivor? My assistant asked, and I wondered if he paid any attention to his surroundings. Much like outside, this room had been coated with what seemed like half a foot of blood, meat, and muscle. Unlike outside, this flesh was still twitching. No, it's not a survivor, I said as I put a hand across his chest to stop him rushing towards her. It isn't like me to intervene on behalf of someone else's stupidity, but then again, I don't like losing leverage either. It's the girl, he said, the one with the implant that you identified, and then I interrupted him. Nope, I repeated. He looked closer, perhaps coming to appreciate the absolutely monstrous expression of hatred painted on her face. That girl would have been the first to go, I said. Her head was used to emit sounds only they can hear. I gestured to the girl-shaped illusion that had now resumed its pacing. A summoning for an angel, something anyone with half a brain would never do, and unfortunately, this summoning worked. And when the angel arrived and realized it had been caught in a trap, it would have smashed whatever was making that noise into pieces, and then it would have summoned every living human it could to try and find whoever had set the bait. And for every person that couldn't help it, it would have gotten angrier and angrier and angrier, I said. Until what? My assistant asked. Until someone arrived to inspect the trap, I replied. Okay, well, we could just let it go, he suggested. The girl stopped pacing once more and looked directly at us. It would kill us if we were lucky, I shot back. Well, I thought angels were good. These things are puppeteers, I said. They can play our nervous system like fiddle and make us see or feel anything they want us to. They can take us apart and put us back together in any arrangement they feel like, because whatever put us on this earth left them behind so they could impregnate unwitting teenagers, split the Red Sea, and conjure whatever other miracles were needed. They were meant to be our caretakers like we were meant to be the caretakers of the earth. Okay, well that sounds like the good guys then, he replied. Think about how we've treated planet Earth, I snapped. Think about how we treat the birds and the animals. Think about the industrial farming. Think about how we treat dogs and cats. Castration and sterilization. We breed them into disability, force them into incest, and clip their ears, break their tails. We euthanize them and put them down when it's convenient, breed them when it isn't. And they, I pointed to the girl, like us, a hell of a lot less than we like dogs. I knew we'd been compromised the second we saw the girl as a girl, and not a scuttling arachnid monstrosity larger than most cars. but I still jumped at the sound of that thing's voice. "Let me go," it said. It meant it had a direct wiretap into our minds. Angels don't do wireless. Everything is physical. Somewhere in that room were organic filaments thinner than hair but tougher than steel, and they'd already breached our suits and were communicating directly with our brainstems. Oh, fuck. Letting you out means that my final moments will be painful, but you're weak, and that much is clear, I said to it. And we've been pumping all sorts of nasty stuff into this place for 2 days straight, and I'm pretty sure that's why I'm not trapped in a literal nightmare of eternal suffering and degradation right now. I asked you to let me go, it said again. Okay, well, we're open to negotiation, I said with a cheerful tone stolen from the barista I'd visited earlier this morning. For a second, the illusion flickered in and out. The girl disappeared, and we all glimpsed a bramble-like knot of chitinous legs that concealed some unseen central mass. Only each limb was as thick as my thigh and covered in undulating hairs and glistening black eyes. I felt an overwhelming desire to kneel. "We will let you go," I said, "if you allow us to go unharmed. We can shut the trap down. We have its creator, and it has shown us how. But we won't do that if it just means that you're going to kill us," I said. The barrage of images it put into my head as a response to this. Let's just say it made Keith Slack's victim look like a Boy Scout. Most eldritch abominations don't have feelings the way we understand them, but angels do. They were deliberately sculpted to understand us and our world so they can better manipulate it from behind the scenes. They're not aliens. They're worse. They are jealous and spiteful and capable of putting these emotions to work on an unprecedented scale. This is the kind of hatred that prompts invisible genocides over some misplaced tea. Whole ethnic groups have been permanently scrubbed from our history because of these things. I'm talking violet eyes and naturally blue hair. Gone. All gone. We don't even remember them. If it wasn't for Agatha, neither would I. "We could kill you, though," I said. "I think we all know that you're not immortal. You're just a thing like us, biological matter that can come undone just as easily." "Not quite as easily," it said. "Your official designation by the others, you know the others," I replied. "The blobs and the goat-footed breeders who go scuttling into dark places. The oozes who were here long before you. They call you Ixodida, after ticks. That's how they see you. You're a parasite like the kind a farmer has to protect his sheep from," I said. "That makes you livestock," it said. "Still, we are at an impasse, though. You are dying, and we're here to help, but it's got to be on our terms," I shot back. Even as I spoke, I could feel the facade of my plan start to crumble. There was no easy out in the situation, and I'd entered into it terrified as to how I was going to make it out. Angels are a sophisticated species, and they would be deeply unhappy to know that a bunch of primitives has gotten the better of one of their own. I'd hoped to try out some kind of negotiating, but that'd be like one of us negotiating with a stray dog that had already bitten a child. No matter what happened, if this angel died, I could count on the others finding me. And that'd be a best-case scenario, living a day or even a week. Unfortunately, I didn't even get that far, though. Without even appearing to move, the angel unmade the guards. I've thought about this a lot, believe me, but there's no other way I can describe it to you. They were pulled apart into their disparate tissues in the blink of an eye. A bloodless vivisection that struck the room like an explosion. Muscles, bone, eyes, teeth, skin, nerve endings. They were thrown against the walls and subsumed into the living carpet of flesh all around us. I had to suppress a whimper as I realized they were still alive, possibly even aware. Beside me, my assistant fell to his knees and began to weep, but I knew that no amount of begging or praying would change the angel's intentions. We just had to hope it'd be relatively quick, and that the consequences wouldn't be terrible. "Your minds taste awful," it boomed, the words so loud I fell to my knees as my willpower crumbled. "Not like the others," it said. "How amusing. It has been so long since I bothered to keep a pet," it roared. My bosses sat before me like 3 judges at a tribunal. "So, you got it to agree to your terms?" one of them said. A man and 2 women with faces that looked like they'd been carved out of granite. The boardroom was supposed to be a professional environment where meetings could be had with other relevant departments, but in truth it just turned into the site of disciplinary meetings like this. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied. "Why?" one of them asked. "Well, he was younger than we thought, just a few hundred years old, and thankfully for us, something of a history buff. That's why he needed the signal from the hospital in the first place. Apparently the creator is something of a taboo topic in their culture. He was hoping to learn a little more about it all. He has been thrilled to enter our organization from within and peruse our archives," I said. "And none of his None of the others have come looking for him? One of the men asked. No need. He is alive and well and enjoying himself. It's business as usual, guys, I said back. There was a knock on the door and I turned to see my assistant poking his head through. He waved and smiled and showed me the tray of coffee he wanted to bring in. I smiled back and gave him a thumbs up. We were always led to believe angels and other Abrahamic abominations were not on the cards for this organization. Will he have trouble working with the program? One of my bosses asked, as the young man placed the tray down and began to distribute drinks. Well, unlike the others, they're actually very well versed in human mannerisms and our society. Not much rehabilitation to do, really. And of course they can appear however they want, so long as they have direct line of sight, I answered. A lot of time they let our mind do the heavy work. We fill in the necessary blanks. If they appear as a policeman, we'll see everything we need in order to support that idea, gun, badge, and so on. Ultimately, it's our minds that make their disguises so convincing, without them even having to move, I explained. And what are you calling him? This angel, one of my bosses said. Youre. My boss's eyes went wide as they processed the voice that had just been inserted directly into their mind. One by one, they lowered their drinks and turned to face my assistant. Even I, who had spent days with the walking nightmare, could not suppress a shiver. Sorry, he said before coughing to clear his throat. Force of habit. I like the name Youre. He told me I couldn't pronounce his name, I explained as my assistant stood behind me and placed a single hand on my shoulder. I tried to ignore the taste of copper in my mouth and the intense itch at the back of my neck. So, I let him pick an appropriate and respectful alternative. And with that, we'll get started with him in the program. I'm certain that he's going to be a joy to work with.